She came home laughing. She had no idea I was already gone. She walked through the front door still riding the high of someone else's laughter. I know that because I watched her. Not from inside the house. I had already left. But from the shadow of a maple tree 3 houses down. Standing in the November cold with my hands buried in my coat pockets. And my heart doing something. Couldn't name. She was smiling. Loose and easy. The way she used to smile at me during the first year we were together. The year before the silences started stacking up. Like unpaid bills. She was carrying a to-go bag in one hand and her heels in the other, which meant she'd kick them off on the front porch the moment she stepped up to the door. She always did that when she'd had a glass or 2 of wine. A small, intimate detail that I had cataloged somewhere in the part of my brain. Devoted entirely to loving her. Her name was Cassandra. Everyone called her Cass. And the man she'd been spending her evenings with, the man she called just a colleague, just a friend, just a mentor, his name was Marcus Holt. He was her department director at the consulting firm where she'd worked for 4 years. He had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, a reputation for being decisive, and a habit of texting her after midnight about things that had absolutely nothing to do with quarterly projections. My name is Elliot Vance, and I am the man she forgot to keep lying to. She called out into the house the moment she stepped inside. I couldn't hear the words from where I stood, but I knew what she said. Something like, "Vance, you up?" Or maybe she used her pet name for me, Bear. She called me Bear because of the flannel shirts I wore around the apartment on winter weekends. She said it first when we were 27 and living in a studio in Portland. She said it like it was the warmest word in the English language. By the time she started having dinners with Marcus, she'd stopped saying it entirely. I watched the downstairs light come on, then the hallway, then the bedroom again, and then, in a strange ripple effect that felt almost cinematic, every light in the house blazed on at once, like she was searching every corner for something she couldn't name. She was looking for me, but I wasn't there anymore. I had removed myself with the kind of quiet precision that only comes from weeks of planning and months of grief, carried alone. Let me take you back to where it actually began. It began on a Tuesday in late September, the kind of day that smells like the last gasp of summer. I was working from home, parked at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cold cup of coffee, when Cassandra came down the stairs already dressed for work. She was in a rush. She was always in a rush in those days, and she grabbed her bag from the counter without stopping to look at me. The bag hung open. She had a habit of leaving it unzipped. And inside, right at the very top, was a paper receipt folded once, and already starting to crumple at the edges. I wasn't looking for it. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't the kind of man who snooped through his wife's belongings. In 7 years of marriage, I had never once read her messages, checked her call history, or opened her laptop without permission. I was, if anything, pathologically trusting. I had watched the evidence accumulate for months, and convinced myself it was all a product of my own insecurity. Marcus was just her boss. The late nights were just the demands of the job. The way she laughed differently when she talked about him was just enthusiasm for her career. I told myself these things so often. They began to feel true. But that receipt was sticking out of the bag, like a tongue. I picked it up before I even made a conscious decision to do so. And then I read it. Dinner for 2. At a restaurant called The Alcove on Harbor Terrace. Way out on the east side of the city near the water. A place I'd never heard her mention, and certainly never been to with her. The bill was substantial. Appetizers, a shared charcuterie board, a bottle of wine, 2 entrees, and creme brulee to finish. The total came to $263. The timestamp read 10:17 p.m. on a Friday night 2 weeks earlier. On that Friday night, Cassandra had told me she was attending a regional conference dinner with her team. She texted me at 7 saying it was running long. At 9 saying the speakers were still going, and at 11 that she was heading home. She came in just after midnight, kissed my temple while I was half asleep on the couch, and went upstairs smelling faintly of wine. And something else I couldn't identify. She didn't order a bottle of wine. With her team, I stood at the kitchen counter with the receipt in my hand, and something inside me went very, very still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a man standing at the edge of something, and finally understanding the depth of the drop. My hands were trembling. I noticed that with a kind of clinical detachment, the way you notice a strange sound in an engine before it fails. I folded the receipt once and placed it in my own pocket. And when Cassandra came back downstairs to say goodbye, I smiled. I told her to have a good day. I asked if she'd be home for dinner. She said she wasn't sure, but to eat without her. I watched her drive away, and then I sat back down at the kitchen table and stared at nothing for a very long time. That was the moment I stopped grieving and started planning. What followed was 22 days of the most focused, methodical, emotionally disciplined work of my life. I went through our joint credit card statements for the previous 6 months and cross-referenced every unusual charge with the cover stories she'd given me. 7 dinners, 3 hotel bar tabs in the city center, 2 transactions at a florist I'd never received flowers from. I found calendar overlaps between her and Marcus on a shared work calendar she'd forgotten I could access, a login she'd given me years ago when we were planning a company event together. I found an email chain between her and her assistant, Danny, in which they coordinated a cover story for a Friday afternoon that Cassandra had told me she spent at a client meeting in the suburbs. I didn't print anything. Not yet. I simply built the picture slowly, piece by piece. The way you'd assemble something fragile. I kept it all on a portable hard drive I bought with cash from a drugstore in a neighborhood across town. Meanwhile, I continued to be her husband. I made coffee in the mornings. I asked about her day. I bought groceries and folded laundry, and laughed at the right moments during the television shows we watched together on the couch. I was so present, so steady, so thoroughly, quietly, demolished inside. There was one night, it was a Thursday, and she told me she was working late again, when I sat alone in our apartment for 3 hours, with a glass of bourbon I didn't finish, and the receipt from Harbor Terrace in front of me on the coffee table. I thought about confronting her. I ran through the scenario so many times. I could have performed it like a script. I imagined her face, the micro-expression of shock, then the pivot, the recalibration, the pivot again into the version of the story she thought I'd believe. I could hear the exact tone she would use, measured, a little hurt, gently offended that I would even suggest such a thing. She was very good at that, at making the truth feel like an accusation. I didn't confront her. Instead, I poured the bourbon down the sink and opened the storage closet and looked at the stack of empty moving boxes we'd kept from the last time we moved apartments. 3 years ago. I stood there looking at them for a while, and then I put the bourbon glass in the recycling and went to bed. But I knew, and knowing was the beginning of the end. On the day I finally left, the day she came home to a house full of shadows and missing picture frames, it had been raining since morning. A low, gray, relentless rain that soaked through everything. I woke early, 4:30 in the morning, and lay in the dark beside her for almost an hour. She was asleep on her side, facing away from me, her hair spread across the pillow. I watched the ceiling. I cataloged every sound in the apartment. The drip of a faucet, the occasional gurgle of the radiator, the distant hum of the city below. I was memorizing it, not because I would miss it exactly, but because I knew this was the last time. I got up without waking her, and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, until the first gray light started seeping in through the windows. Then I opened the storage closet, and pulled out the boxes. I started with the sentimental things, Not because I was sentimental at that particular moment. I had burned most of that away over the previous 3 weeks. But because I knew that if I left them, she would use them. She would call me and say, "You forgot your grandmother's chess set." And that would become the foot in the door, the beginning of a conversation I was not willing to have. So I packed everything. The chess set, the framed photograph of me and my brother at the coastline, the ceramic mug with the chip in the handle that I'd bought at a market in Lisbon the year before we got married, the little stack of birthday cards she'd given me over the years. I packed those too, because they were mine, even if everything that had once given them meaning was now in question. By 10 in the morning, the bedroom was bare on my side. By noon, the bathroom counter had only her things on it. By 2 o'clock, my half of the closet was empty, the hangers swinging slightly in the draft from the air vent, like they hadn't quite accepted the news. I worked in silence. No music, no podcast, nothing to fill the air, but the sound of cardboard folding and tape being pulled from the dispenser. It felt important to work in silence. It felt like the right kind of ceremony for what was happening. At 3:15, I received a notification from our joint credit card account. Cassandra had used the card for lunch at a restaurant downtown. Steak, sparkling water, and an item described as a companion meal, which was not an item that appeared on any menu, and which told me everything I needed to know. About the companion, she wasn't even being careful anymore. Maybe she thought she didn't need to be. Maybe she had decided that I was the kind of man who would always find a way to explain things away. She wasn't wrong. I had been that man. I wasn't that man anymore. I called my brother Garrett. He lives 2 hours north of the city in a small town, where he runs a woodworking shop out of a barn he renovated himself. I told him in vague terms a few weeks earlier that things were not good. He hadn't asked for details. He just said, "You know where I am." And that was enough. When I called that afternoon, I told him I was coming. He said, "I'll leave the side door unlocked." I heard his wife, Sandra, ask quietly in the background who was on the phone. He told her. There was a brief pause, and then she said, "Tell him there's soup on the stove." That was the moment that almost broke me. Not the receipt, not the hotel bar tabs, not the 7 secret dinners. It was the soup. It was the understanding that people who loved me had been quietly holding space for this day, for longer than I had. I loaded the last boxes into a rented cargo van I'd arranged for earlier that week. I cleaned the bathroom. I vacuumed the floors. I took out the recycling. I wiped down the kitchen counter and straightened the dish towels and replaced the paper towel roll, because I am not the kind of man who leaves things in chaos, even on the day his life comes apart at the seams. Before I closed the door for the last time, I did one final thing. I took my wedding ring off my finger and placed it on the kitchen windowsill, beside the small succulent she'd named after a character in a television show she loved. I placed it right there, in the thin strip of winter light coming through the glass, and I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked up the last bag, walked out, and pulled the door shut behind me. I drove to a parking spot 3 blocks from our building, and then, without really planning to, I turned the engine off and sat there. I don't know exactly how long I sat in that van. Long enough for the light to start changing, for the afternoon to go gray, and then genuinely dark. I told myself I was waiting to make sure she got home safely. That's the kind of lie you tell yourself, when the truth, that you are not yet ready to fully leave, is still too sharp to hold directly. I sat there until I saw headlights turn the corner onto our street. Her car. The familiar sound of the engine. I watched her park. I watched her get out with the to-go bag and her heels in her hand, moving with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who has no idea. The floor has already given way beneath them. She went inside. The downstairs light came on. I gave it 4 minutes. Then I started the engine and drove north. I didn't sleep much that first night at Garrett's. The guest room had a window that faced the woods, and I lay on top of the covers in the dark, watching the shapes of trees shift in the wind. The room smelled like cedar and machine oil. My brother had left a glass of water on the bedside table, and a worn paperback he thought I might want, which I didn't open, but which I was grateful for anyway. I lay there and let all the memories I'd been suppressing for weeks unspool through my mind like a film reel I could no longer pause. The night she first mentioned Marcus Holt. 3 years into her job at the firm, at dinner at a Thai restaurant we liked, she mentioned him casually, with affection, the way you might mention a good professor you'd once had. He was brilliant, she said, and funny, and he really listened to people. I remember thinking he sounded interesting. I remember being glad she'd found a mentor she respected. The evening 8 months ago, when I came home to find her laughing into her phone, in a way I recognized but couldn't place the particular pitch of it. The way she caught herself when she heard me at the door, and her expression shifted. Just slightly. I noticed, and I filed it away, and I said nothing. The Saturday morning she slept in, and left her phone face up on the bathroom counter while she showered, and I walked past and saw his name on the screen, above a message I didn't read. I walked out of the bathroom and made breakfast, and we ate together and talked about whether we should go to the farmer's market. And I never said a word. I wonder now what might have happened if I had. But I think I already knew it was too late. Even then, I finally fell asleep somewhere around 4 in the morning. When I woke, gray November light was coming through the window, and Garrett was already in the kitchen. He didn't ask questions over breakfast. He just poured coffee and pushed a plate of eggs toward me, and talked about the chair he was working on, a Victorian rocker with a cracked arm, and what he was thinking of using for the repair. I was grateful for the ordinary shape of it. My phone had 42 missed calls from Cassandra, 7 voicemails. I listened to the voicemails in chronological order, sitting in Garrett's truck in the driveway with the engine off. The first one was calm, controlled, almost professional in its steadiness. Elliot, hey, I'm home and you're not here. I need you to call me. I don't know what's going on, but I need you to call me. The second was less steady, a breath before she spoke. Okay, so I can see that some of your things are missing. I don't understand what's happening. Please just call me. The third voicemail broke from the careful register she'd been maintaining. Her voice splintered at the edges. She said she didn't know what she'd done to make me do this, which was not quite a lie, but not quite the truth either. And she asked me to please come home. I noticed, over the course of the 7 voicemails, that she never said she was sorry. She said she didn't know what she'd done. She said I was being cruel. She said I had no right to do this without talking to her first. She said I was scaring her. She said if I wanted to punish her, there were better ways. But she did not once, in any of those messages, use the word sorry. I don't think she was withholding it strategically. I think she had simply constructed such an elaborate internal justification for what she'd been doing. By the third day, the voicemails had stopped. In their place came text messages, varying in tone from conciliatory to accusatory and back again. And then, on the morning of the 4th day, something unexpected happened. At 7:40 in the morning, a message arrived from a number I didn't recognize. It was short. She's devastated. You should be ashamed of yourself. No name. No introduction. But there was only one person it could have been. Marcus Holt had sent me a text message. I read it 3 times. And with each reading, the thing inside me that had been cold and settled and controlled since September grew colder still. He had the audacity to weigh in on my life. The man who had shared secret dinners with my wife, who had exchanged thousands of messages with her after midnight, who had been conducting an affair with the woman, who once promised me forever. This man wanted me to feel ashamed of myself for leaving. I understood something in that moment that I hadn't fully understood before. He didn't see himself as the problem. In his version of this story, I was the obstacle, the inconvenient, oversensitive husband, who was making things difficult. for two people who simply belonged together. He had convinced himself, and probably convinced Cassandra, that what they had was something real and right, and that my presence in her life was the unfortunate complication. Standing in the way of that, I did not respond to the message. Instead, I drove into town, bought a coffee and a yellow legal pad, and sat at a corner table in a diner, and began writing down every piece of evidence I had collected over the past 3 weeks, not to use it carelessly. I had no interest in public spectacle, no desire to humiliate anyone on social media, or send poison pen letters to mutual friends. What I wanted was precision. I wanted the truth to land somewhere it would matter, delivered in the format it deserved. Clean, documented, irrefutable. Marcus Holt worked for a firm with 87 employees, and a client roster that included 3 publicly traded companies. The firm had a code of conduct policy that was 8 pages long. I had read it online. Section 4, Subsection 2, Conflict of Interest in Supervisory Relationships. Section 7, Conduct that may bring the organization into disrepute. What I did was assemble my materials into a document. Photographs, credit card statements, calendar records, the email chain with Danny the assistant, a timeline of dates and locations, and I placed them in a sealed envelope, with a typed cover letter that was 3 sentences long. I addressed it to the firm's ethics and compliance officer. I drove to a post office on the far side of the city, and mailed it with a money order, so there was no return address. And then I drove back to Garrett's, and sanded a chair with him in the barn. For the rest of the afternoon, I felt nothing dramatic in the days that followed. The thing about executing a plan is that it occupies the same mental space that grief would otherwise move into, and once the plan is complete, the grief comes back, quieter, but somehow more total. I thought about small things, the way she used to leave notes on the bathroom mirror for me in steam. Just words, sometimes funny, sometimes just my name. The afternoon in Burlington when we walked through a gallery, and she stood in front of a painting for 20 minutes, not saying anything, and afterwards said it was the first time in months she'd felt completely present. The road trip we took through the mountains the summer before all of this started, when we pulled over at a state park and sat on a boulder above a lake, eating gas station sandwiches, and she laid her head on my shoulder and said, quietly, that she was the happiest she'd ever been. I chose to believe that was true. I thought, in fact, that it probably was true at that exact moment. The tragedy of what happened between us is not that she was always lying. It is that for a long time she wasn't. And then somewhere along the way, the truth became too difficult, or too frightening, or too small for what she thought she deserved. And she began building something else alongside it. In the dark, on the 14th day, she appeared. I was in Garrett's barn, working on a side table with a warped leg. Sandra had brought out coffee and left without saying much, which was very much in character for her. I was using a hand plane focused on the grain when I heard footsteps on the gravel path outside. Light footsteps, careful. I knew it was her before I looked up. Cassandra was standing in the doorway of the barn. She was wearing the dark green coat she'd had for 3 years, the one with the tortoiseshell buttons, that she'd bought at a second-hand shop and repaired twice herself. Her hair was down and slightly damp. She was not wearing makeup, and beneath her right eye, there was a bruise, pale but unmistakable, yellowing at the edges, the kind that is 4 or 5 days old, and still hasn't fully faded. I set down the hand plane. I did not speak. I let her stand there in the doorway, and I looked at the bruise, and I waited. She said, "Can we talk?" I said, "You have 5 minutes." She came inside. She stood near the work table, not reaching for anything, not performing anything. Her hands were at her sides. She looked like someone who had rehearsed something many times, and then, upon arrival, found that all the rehearsal had been for the wrong speech. She told me she had ended things with Marcus. Not the way I might have imagined. Not a clean, principled ending, but a difficult, frightening one. She had gone to him and told him that she was going to find me, that she needed to make things right. He had not received this well. He had taken her phone. He had pushed her. She'd hit the corner of a shelf. I looked at her for a long time. I looked at the bruise and at her hands, and at the way she was holding herself. And I tried to figure out what was true, not because I was considering taking her back. I had made peace with that impossibility days ago, but because I needed to know, for my own sake, whether what she was telling me was real. I decided it was. Not all of it, maybe. The instinct to shape a narrative runs deep in people who have been shaping narratives for a long time. But the bruise was real. The fear was real. The exhaustion was real. I did not touch her. I handed her a blanket from the barn shelf because the November air was coming in cold through the open door, and I told her I would drive her to a motel. Not invite her in. Not put her up in the guest room. A motel. I made that distinction clearly, and she nodded as if she had expected it. The drive was 20 minutes. She held the blanket in her lap and looked out the window. She asked once if I was okay. I said I was getting there. She didn't ask again. At the motel, I watched her take her bag from the back seat and walk toward the lobby door. She paused with her hand on the handle and turned around. In the cold orange light of the motel sign, she looked very young and very tired, and like someone who had been traveling a very long way toward a reckoning she'd been trying to outrun. She said, "I know you did something with the firm." I said nothing. She said, "I know it was you, and I just want you to know. I understand why." I started the engine. She went inside. I drove back to Garrett's through the dark, empty roads. And for the first time since September, I felt the actual weight of the grief lift slightly. Not because she had apologized. She hadn't. Not really. Not with the full architecture of what an apology should contain. But because something was finished. The story had come to its end. 3 weeks later, the internal review at the firm concluded. Marcus Holt tendered his resignation. There was a brief, carefully worded statement from the firm about leadership changes and a renewed commitment to workplace values. A journalist published a piece in a corporate ethics newsletter about supervisory misconduct in mid-sized professional services firms. No names, but enough detail for those who were looking. The junior consultant who had resigned 18 months earlier left a comment under the article that said only, "Thank you for printing this." I thought about that comment for a long time. Cassandra sent one final message 6 weeks after my departure. For sentences. She said she was still in therapy. She said she had found a new apartment. She said she hoped I was somewhere I could breathe. She said she was sorry. Not in the form of an explanation or a justification, or a list of circumstances. Just sorry. Plain and direct, and, I thought, finally true. I wrote back once. 3 words. "I know you are." And that was the last time. By January, I had moved into a cabin. Not a romantic getaway. Nothing cinematic about it. A small, practical wooden structure 40 minutes from Garrett's, set back from a 2-lane road, with a long gravel driveway, and a wood stove, and a view from the kitchen window of a frozen lake that looked in the early morning like a sheet of hammered silver. I had very few things. The chess set, the Lisbon mug, the books I'd been accumulating my whole life, and rarely had time to read. I began reading them, one after another, in the evenings by the wood stove, with a glass of something warm, and the sound of the wind in the trees outside. I helped Garrett in the shop 2 or 3 days a week, learning things slowly, how to identify wood grain, how to use a cabinet scraper, how much pressure to apply before you split something. I started running again, a habit I'd abandoned in my late 20s. I went to bed early and woke early, and spent the first hour of every morning in the quiet before the day started, watching the light change on the lake. cannot tell you it was easy. There were nights when the loss was enormous and shapeless, when I lay awake in the dark of the cabin and felt the full weight of everything that was gone. Not just the marriage, but the future I had mapped out inside it. The children we'd vaguely, hopefully talked about. The house we'd always said we'd eventually buy. The ordinary, beautiful life I had believed we were building together. In good faith. Grief like that doesn't have a schedule. It arrives when it arrives. The only thing to do with it is let it come, and let it go, and trust that eventually the intervals between arrivals will lengthen, and they did. Slowly, incrementally, the way all true things happen. By February, I was sleeping through the night most nights. By March, I could go a full day without thinking about her. By April, I stood on the dock at the edge of the lake, in the first real warmth of the year, watching ice break up in the coves, in long slow sheets, and I realized I hadn't been sad. In 4 days, that's when I knew I was going to be all right. I am not going to tell you that what she did was forgivable. I am not going to tell you that I understand it. Not completely, because there is a part of what happened that I will probably never fully understand. The mechanics of how someone can love a person sincerely and still betray them so methodically and for so long. I think that is the hardest thing to make peace with. Not the betrayal itself, which was painful but at least legible, but the distance between who she actually was and who I had believed her to be. But I have made a decision. The decision is this. I am not going to organize my life around that question. I am not going to let the answer, whatever it is, determine what I believe is possible. I loved her genuinely and without reservation, and I built a real life with her. And those things are also true, alongside everything else. Both things are real. Both things get to exist. What I do know is this. I am the man who left quietly, who refused to make a scene, who carried his own grief with the same care he had always carried everything else. I am the man who gathered the evidence and made the decisions and drove away in the dark without looking back. I am the man sitting in a cabin by a frozen lake, learning how to be still. I am not small anymore. I have not been small in months. And that, more than any reckoning, more than any envelope, more than any final exchange, in a parking lot under an orange motel sign, is the thing I am most proud of. She set something in motion when she stopped seeing me, but I am the one who decided what happened next. And what happened next was me.